Venice, 1789. Fog clung to the canals like a living shroud, thick and suffocating, carrying the weight of silence and secrets. The orphanage stood at the end of a narrow alley, a looming edifice of dark stone and decaying timber, swallowing light, sound, and hope. Whispers slithered through the streets, tales of cruelty, neglect, and a boy who watched silently from shadowed corners. Matteo. Small, unnervingly observant, a figure who blended into darkness and moved without detection. His eyes missed nothing. Every creak of the wooden floors, every flicker of candlelight, every whispered footstep was catalogued, memorized, and analyzed in meticulous detail. Children sensed him first. Even before adults, they noticed the quiet presence. A figure whose movements were almost imperceptible, whose attention was absolute. Some felt comfort, others unease. All were marked by his silent observation. Outside, the city continued its routine. Gondolas sliding silently through canals, merchants calling from shaded corners, the masked elites preparing for balls. But inside the orphanage, tension grew, thick as the fog outside. Fear was subtle yet pervasive, growing in every corridor, seeping into every room, unspoken yet undeniable. Rumors of strange events began to circulate quietly among the city folk. Minor disappearances, broken objects, inexplicable accidents, all attributed to careless children or mismanagement, yet no explanation satisfied anyone. Matteo observed, recording each reaction, watching as caretakers became frustrated, as children whispered in corners, as panic began to bubble beneath the surface. He learned quickly who could be manipulated, who would react predictably, and how best to guide events unseen. His intelligence, silent and patient, became the orphanage's invisible force. The walls themselves seemed complicit, absorbing every whisper, every footstep, every minor disturbance. Drafts moved unpredictably through hallways, candles flickered with unnatural rhythm, and shadows stretched and twisted unnervingly in the dim light. The orphanage, a building meant for safety and care, had become a stage, its corridors and rooms rehearsed in the mind of a boy whose patience and intellect surpassed any adult present. Matteo catalogued everything: the placement of furniture, the alignment of doors, the timing of routines. Every element contributed to a growing crescendo of fear and tension. Caretakers remained unaware. They assumed children's tales of shadows, strange noises, or missing items were imagination or deflection. Minor arguments escalated, frustrations flared over trivial mistakes, and a pattern of unrest emerged, exactly as Matteo intended. He watched how authority fractured, how fear magnified, and how human behavior could be predicted with careful observation. Every misstep was recorded, every reaction logged in the silent corridors of his mind. Children began to whisper of him, the boy who always knew, the boy who watched silently, whose presence was everywhere yet nowhere. Nightfall deepened the atmosphere. Fog pressed against the orphanage walls, muffling the city outside, creating a vacuum of sound in which even the smallest noise was magnified. Candlelight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Matteo used this to his advantage, understanding how perception could twist reality. Children's whispers carried farther in the silence, their voices trembling yet clear, spreading tales that increased tension among adults. Every detail was calculated, every moment observed, every reaction anticipated. By the end of the first week, the tension had become nearly unbearable. Caretakers argued over minor accidents, discipline became erratic, and children's stories of the silent boy grew in confidence and frequency. Matteo remained invisible, yet every event bent to his understanding of human psychology. He had mapped the building, memorized every pattern, and calculated human responses. Shadows, whispers, and fear converged into a living network of psychological manipulation. The orphanage was ready, its environment and occupants aligned for a moment of inevitable catastrophe. The orphanage in Venice had been constructed in 1765, a sprawling building of stone and timber perched along a narrow canal. Its walls, darkened by decades of neglect and damp, absorbed light and sound, creating an atmosphere that seemed to pulse with unspoken tension. Originally designed to shelter abandoned children, the orphanage had long lost its purpose of care. Instead, it became a place where fear and authority intertwined, and every minor infraction was met with harsh punishment. Matteo arrived in this environment as a small, unassuming child, but his mind recorded everything. Every corridor, beam, window, and floorboard became an internal map. Every adult routine catalogued, and every reaction observed for future strategy. Caretakers were chosen more for their ability to maintain control than for compassion. Many had histories of cruelty disguised as discipline. They administered order with indifference and occasional bursts of rage, enforcing rules with rigid precision. Matteo watched silently as they moved through their routines, noting patterns, vulnerabilities, and moments of overconfidence. Children were often scolded for minor missteps, while larger acts of neglect went unnoticed. These conditions nurtured fear, anxiety, and obedience which Matteo absorbed, understanding the mechanics of human behavior in confined, hierarchical spaces. The children themselves formed a fragmented society. Some were defiant, challenging authority with subtle gestures, while others submitted to fear, internalizing punishment and intimidation. Matteo observed them all, identifying strengths, weaknesses, and predictable behaviors. He noted which children could be guided safely, who might inadvertently increase chaos, and how alliances among them shifted under stress. His intelligence allowed him to manipulate perceptions subtly, ensuring that the environment worked in tandem with his observations. Every whispered rumor, every reaction to a caretaker's anger, became part of a growing dataset, a mental blueprint of human response under pressure. Venice in 1789 was a city of contrasts, its canals reflecting grandeur and decay alike. Fog rolled over the waterways each morning, shrouding the city in mystery. Markets bustled with activity, masked balls dazzled the elite, and yet the orphanage remained hidden in shadowed alleys. The juxtaposition of Venice's vibrancy with the dark interior of the orphanage amplified the boy's isolation and observation. Matteo became attuned not only to human behavior, but also to environmental conditions, fog, light, and sound, understanding how they could influence perception, conceal movement, and amplify fear. Minor incidents escalated as Matteo integrated into the orphanage. A candle knocked over, a misaligned floorboard, or a door left slightly ajar. Each tested caretakers' vigilance, children's reactions, and the building's vulnerabilities. Matteo cataloged responses meticulously. Who panicked first? Who attempted control? Who froze silently? Each observation refined his understanding, aligning human behavior with environmental conditions in preparation for a future crescendo of calculated events. Children whispered tales of a silent figure who knew everything, unseen yet everywhere. These tales, though dismissed by adults, reinforced fear, paranoia, and subtle obedience. The physical layout of the orphanage contributed to tension. Long corridors created echo chambers. Uneven floors amplified minor disturbances. Drafty windows allowed shadows and cold air to infiltrate, increasing discomfort. Matteo memorized every inch of the structure, predicting how movement, sound, and light would interact to amplify human responses. Every room, every hidden alcove, every beam was considered in his mental mapping. Even the most trivial architectural feature, such as a slightly warped door hinge, became a potential variable in his calculations. Caretakers remained unaware of the extent of observation. Their routines, repetitive and rigid, made them predictable. Matteo exploited this predictability, understanding how authority could fracture under pressure. Minor mishaps escalated tension, small accidents magnified fear, and children's whispered stories amplified paranoia. Through patience and subtle influence, he aligned human reactions and environmental factors, preparing the stage for an event that would shock Venice. Outside, the canals reflected the city's contrasts. Fog muted sounds, creating a vacuum in which whispers carried farther, shadows lengthened unnaturally, and perception became unreliable. Matteo's intelligence allowed him to use these environmental variables to his advantage, anticipating how external conditions would interact with internal fear. The orphanage became a microcosm of human behavior, observed, analyzed, and guided by a single child whose intellect and patience surpassed every adult in the building. Weeks of observation and subtle manipulation established a rhythm. Minor disturbances, overlooked negligence, and children's whispers created a pressure cooker of tension. Caretakers became increasingly volatile, misinterpreting events as sabotage or incompetence. Children began to anticipate Matteo's guidance instinctively, moving in ways that would later align with his plans. Each detail, human or architectural, was cataloged, integrated, and prepared for eventual escalation. The environment itself seemed complicit, corridors echoing faint cries, shadows twisting unnaturally, and even the fog outside acting as a shield for observation and preparation. By the end of the background period, Venice was unaware of the storm gathering within its orphanage walls. The building, the children, and the adults were all part of a carefully observed and mapped system. Matteo had studied patterns, behaviors, and environmental factors with precision, ensuring that every variable aligned for the night that would define tragedy, fear, and legend. The historical context, the location, and the characters were now fully in place. The stage for the boys' orchestration was set with meticulous care, and the silent presence of Matteo became the unseen force around which all future events would pivot. The caretakers' personalities varied, yet all shared a common flaw: underestimation of the children and in particular of Matteo. Some relied on fear alone, using sharp words, physical punishment, and strict routines. Others attempted manipulation, offering rewards for compliance or obedience. Matteo studied every tactic, noting which created resistance, which induced panic, and which failed entirely. Each observation added to his mental map of human behavior, refining predictions and allowing him to manipulate circumstances subtly. Children became instruments in his strategy, responding instinctively to cues and environmental shifts that he had meticulously analyzed. Every day brought new opportunities. Minor disputes over chores, whispered disagreements, and small accidents became exercises in observation. Matteo learned how to guide events without revealing his influence. A spilled cup of water could provoke a reprimand, which in turn caused a ripple of anxiety. A door left slightly ajar allowed shadows to stretch unnaturally, creating fear. Every detail, no matter how trivial, was recorded and used to shape the trajectory of events. By controlling perception rather than imposing force directly, Matteo ensured that his influence remained invisible, subtle, and absolute. The children's responses were particularly informative. Some were naturally cautious, others impulsive, and a few rebellious. Matteo recognized potential allies and potential disruptors. Alliances formed, loyalties shifted, and he cataloged these interactions carefully. By subtly guiding movements, whispering suggestions, or allowing events to unfold naturally, he ensured that human behavior aligned with his observations. Fear, trust, and anticipation became tools. The orphanage itself became an extension of his intellect. Every corridor, staircase, and shadow part of a living experiment in control, observation, and strategy. Venice's external world seemed distant and indifferent. Gondolas glided through canals, merchants hawked goods, and masked balls drew attention elsewhere. Yet the orphanage existed as a microcosm within this larger city, a closed system governed by observation, fear, and meticulous calculation. Matteo understood the isolation, recognizing that adults outside the orphanage could never fully intervene or perceive the subtleties of daily tension inside. The fog, the shadows, the labyrinthine alleys, and the silent water all enhanced the boy's ability to operate unseen. He transformed Venice's neglect into a tool for planning, patience, and observation. Environmental factors were integral. Drafts shifted candle flames, fog muffled distant sounds, and uneven floors amplified small disturbances. Matteo's calculations accounted for these variables, predicting how each would influence perception and reaction. Caretakers, unaware of his analysis, moved predictably, their behavior a textbook demonstration of authority under pressure. Minor mistakes escalated, shadows warped, and children whispered tales of a silent, omniscient presence. Matteo's patience and precision ensured that each variable, human and architectural, aligned perfectly for future escalation. Small incidents accumulated into patterns. A candle tipping over, a creaking floorboard, a sudden gust of wind. All were recorded in Matteo's memory, connected to behavioral responses. Children, while frightened, began moving in subtle ways that aligned with his observations. Caretakers grew increasingly anxious, unaware that every action and reaction had been anticipated. The orphanage's hallways, staircases, and hidden alcoves became arenas of observation and control. Every feature cataloged, every behavior predicted, every potential outcome considered. The psychological pressure on adults grew. Frustration turned to paranoia. Small mistakes were overreacted to, and authority fractured under the weight of accumulated stress. Matteo's careful observation allowed him to remain invisible. Even as his influence became omnipresent, children whispered more confidently about the silent boy, spreading subtle fear and uncertainty. The environment and the human occupants were now aligned, ready for a crescendo of controlled events. The orphanage itself seemed to respond to his presence. Corridors echoing faint, unexplained sounds, shadows stretching unnaturally, and the atmosphere thick with anticipation. By the time 1789 approached its final months, Every element was meticulously prepared. Human behavior, architectural quirks, environmental factors, and psychological pressure were all mapped, observed, and integrated into a plan of extraordinary patience and precision. Matteo, small and silent, had transformed a neglected orphanage into a living laboratory of fear, anticipation, and control. The stage for tragedy, chaos, and legend was complete. The city outside remained unaware, fog-bound, and indifferent, while inside a silent boy orchestrated events with intelligence, patience, and foresight far beyond his years. Whispers began to spread through the orphanage, subtle yet persistent. Children told one another of the silent boy who watched, whose eyes seemed to penetrate walls and doors. At first, adults dismissed these murmurs as childish imagination, but the repetition and consistency of accounts became difficult to ignore. Minor incidents escalated seemingly by coincidence. A toy missing from a shelf, a candle extinguished unexpectedly, footsteps echoing down empty corridors. Each event reinforced the legend, feeding fear and anticipation, a rising tension that Matteo observed with meticulous precision. Caretakers, increasingly uneasy, began questioning their own observations. They noticed shadows where none should have existed, sounds without identifiable sources, and fleeting glimpses of movement just beyond their line of sight. Anxiety spread among adults as small mistakes and accidents multiplied unnaturally. Matteo's presence, still undetected, orchestrated the environment subtly. Floors creaked in predictable sequences, drafty windows allowed unnatural air currents, and candlelight flickered to accentuate shadows. Every detail, no matter how trivial, contributed to a controlled crescendo of fear and uncertainty. Children, aware of Matteo's silent observation, began to act instinctively under his guidance. Some moved cautiously, following his subtle signals. Others whispered warnings, adjusting the behavior of peers without realizing they were part of a larger orchestration. The orphanage became a living network of psychological influence. Each reaction, every movement carefully recorded and interpreted by Matteo. Patterns emerged, illustrating the fragility of adult authority when faced with coordinated observation, fear, and manipulation. Rumors spread beyond the orphanage walls. Parents, neighbors, and merchants spoke quietly of unexplained phenomena, strange shadows and children behaving oddly. Venice's fog and labyrinthine alleys amplified these tales, creating an atmosphere of suspense and uncertainty. Although the city's elite continued their social rituals, a sense of unease persisted near the orphanage. Matteo understood the importance of rumor, cultivating it among children and observing its ripple effects on adults. Fear, once internal, began to manifest outwardly, reinforcing control without direct confrontation. The pattern of small accidents intensified. Candles toppled in empty rooms, doors swung open without cause, and distant laughter echoed through hallways. Children interpreted these events in line with Matteo's silent guidance, following paths that minimized danger and maximized tension. Caretakers, increasingly paranoid, overreacted to minor mistakes. Each reaction fed the boys' understanding of human behavior under pressure. Through patience, observation, and environmental manipulation, Matteo ensured that the orphanage was a perfect microcosm of fear, anticipation, and control. Night after night, the atmosphere grew heavier. Shadows lengthened unnaturally under candlelight. Corridors seemed to breathe with silence, and faint whispers moved through empty rooms. Matteo's mental map expanded, integrating every event into a complex understanding of human response, architectural quirks, and environmental factors. Children moved instinctively, adults reacted predictably, and the orphanage itself became a stage upon which tension, fear, and observation intertwined seamlessly. The crescendo of events approached steadily, unnoticed by those outside. Small signs of unease became more pronounced. Caretakers argued over trivial matters, misplaced objects caused disproportionate reactions, and minor injuries were exaggerated. The cumulative effect of observation, subtle guidance, and environmental control created a pressure cooker, primed for inevitable escalation. Matteo's patience ensured that every variable aligned perfectly, every human reaction anticipated, and every element of the orphanage prepared for the climax. Shadows, whispers, and fear were now active participants in the orchestration of tension. Children began to develop unspoken signals, subtle gestures that communicated awareness of the silent presence. A glance, a shift in posture, or a barely audible murmur could convey information without alerting caretakers. Matteo's influence spread through these minor interactions, shaping behavior, guiding movement, and amplifying tension. Every whisper, every adjustment in behavior was recorded in his mind, forming an intricate network of observation and response. The orphanage itself responded like a living organism, corridors echoing faint sounds, floors creaking under invisible weight, and shadows stretching unnaturally in candlelight. Caretakers became increasingly unpredictable. Fatigue, frustration, and subtle fear undermined authority. Arguments erupted over minor mistakes. Routines were disrupted and discipline became inconsistent. Matteo observed each breakdown, integrating these responses into his mental blueprint. Even the most minor reactions provided insight into human behavior, revealing patterns that would later be crucial. The cumulative effect was a fracturing of control, a weakening of adult authority, and an amplification of tension among children and staff alike. Rumors within the orphanage evolved into subtle legends. Children whispered that the silent boy could see everything, that he knew who would falter, who would panic, and who would obey instinctively. These tales, although unverified, reinforced fear among caretakers and anticipation among children. Each story, each repeated account became part of Matteo's orchestration, shaping perceptions and directing behavior. The alignment of rumor, observation, and environmental factors created a feedback loop, strengthening the psychological web that enveloped the orphanage. Environmental manipulation became more pronounced. Matteo guided children to place objects, adjust candles, or shift furniture in ways that subtly amplified shadows and echoes. Drafts and uneven floors were used to create unpredictability, forcing adults to overreact or misinterpret events. Minor noises, creaking doors, falling objects, footsteps, were timed and observed, each reaction feeding the boy's understanding of control and influence. The orphanage, though physically static, had become dynamic under his influence, a stage where fear, rumor, and manipulation converged. As days passed, the crescendo of tension approached inevitability. Children acted with instinctive awareness of the silent orchestrator. Shadows and whispers amplified uncertainty, and caretakers' predictability allowed for precise manipulation. Every corridor, every room, every minor interaction had been accounted for in Matteo's calculations. The building itself, combined with human behavior, became an intricate mechanism designed to heighten anticipation and psychological pressure. The unseen presence, moving silently and observing relentlessly, shaped every facet of the environment. The culmination of these small, precise events established a rhythm that heightened the emotional intensity of the orphanage. Children became acutely aware of potential dangers, moving with caution, whispering quietly, and responding to subtle cues. Caretakers, now increasingly anxious, misinterpreted events, reacting with overconfidence or undue alarm. This perfect storm of observation, anticipation, and manipulation allowed Matteo to orchestrate outcomes without ever revealing his presence. Fear had become both instrument and outcome, carefully cultivated over weeks of meticulous study. By the time the final week of build-up arrived, Venice remained unaware of the mounting tension. The city continued its rhythm of canals, markets, and masked festivities, oblivious to the orchestrated fear within the orphanage walls. Matteo's observation and manipulation were complete. The environment, the children, and the adults were aligned. Every variable, human and environmental, had been anticipated. Shadows, whispers, and minor disturbances ensured that every reaction contributed to the climax that would soon unfold, leaving an indelible mark on the city, the orphanage, and the lives of those within it. The night arrived with an unnatural stillness, Venice cloaked in dense fog that muted every distant sound. The orphanage seemed to hold its breath, corridors twisting with shadows, floors creaking softly as if anticipating the events to come. Matteo, small and silent, moved with precise calculation, guiding children through hidden paths he had memorized over weeks of observation. The caretakers, unaware of the boy's preparation, followed their usual routines, their authority fractured, their perception manipulated by subtle environmental cues and accumulated tension. Candles flickered in empty rooms, casting long, wavering shadows that danced along the walls. A door shifted slightly in its frame, a floorboard groaned under invisible weight, and a distant whisper echoed down a corridor, untraceable to its source. Fear had been cultivated meticulously. Caretakers' reactions were predictable, escalating minor disturbances into heightened alarm. Children moved instinctively, following Matteo's subtle signals, guided through hallways that amplified the psychological tension. Every element, human and architectural, had been orchestrated to perfection. The first signs of chaos emerged when a caretaker discovered a toppled candle near the dining hall. Panic surged. Words were raised sharply and minor scuffles broke out as others misinterpreted the cause. Matteo observed silently from the shadows, noting reactions, adjusting the positions of children, and subtly influencing movements to ensure maximum psychological effect. The environment amplified fear. Flickering light created distorted shapes, echoing footsteps suggested unseen presences, and the fog outside shrouded any possibility of outside intervention. Whispers among the children intensified. Some moved closer to Matteo for guidance, while others carried messages between corridors, spreading awareness and subtly controlling adult behavior. The caretakers, now deeply unnerved, failed to see patterns, their authority undermined by fear, confusion, and meticulously crafted environmental manipulation. Matteo's silent orchestration ensured that every reaction, every panic, every misjudgment aligned perfectly with his calculated plan. Smoke began to drift through select corridors, carefully ignited from candles tipped just enough to flare without immediate danger. The scent of burning wood and wax filled the air, triggering alarm and disorientation. Adults scrambled, attempting to control children, extinguish flames, and restore order. But each action had been anticipated. Corridors were crowded, paths blocked, and children guided through alternate routes, their movements synchronized with Matteo's silent directions. Shadows lengthened, whispers grew louder, and chaos spread like a controlled storm. The climax escalated rapidly. A second candle tipped near the main staircase, flames licking the walls, and a caretaker slipped on the polished floor, sending a chain reaction of startled screams. Children froze and then moved obediently under Matteo's guidance, avoiding danger while reinforcing confusion among adults. Every step, every turn, every misstep was calculated. The orphanage itself seemed to pulse with tension, its architecture complicit in the unfolding orchestration of fear. Caretakers attempted to regain control, but failed. The combination of minor environmental hazards, accumulated psychological pressure, and coordinated child movement made every intervention futile. Panic spread, alliances fractured, and predictable human reactions played into Matteo's design. A single precise action, slightly shifting a hallway obstacle, channeled movement toward safety for the children yet intensified adult confusion. The brilliance of his observation and patience became undeniable, a silent force shaping reality without detection. Smoke, shadows, and whispers converged into a crescendo of terror. Matteo moved with ghost-like precision, ensuring that no child was harmed directly, yet the adults were overwhelmed, unable to interpret the orchestrated sequence. Each flash of fear, each misstep, each panicked reaction contributed to the peak of the climax, where environment, psychology, and silent manipulation collided in a perfect storm. Caretakers' authority disintegrated entirely, their efforts rendered futile by an unseen intelligence operating flawlessly within the building. The night reached its apex as small fires flared, shadows twisted, and confusion reached its maximum. Children under Matteo's silent guidance moved calmly and efficiently, avoiding danger while adults succumbed to panic. Each detail, the position of furniture, the draft through a window, the timing of footsteps, was leveraged to heighten fear and reinforce chaos. The orphanage had transformed into a living theater of tension, orchestrated by the smallest, most unassuming presence within its walls. By dawn, the climax had run its course. The building, though damaged, remained intact. Caretakers were shaken, exhausted, and psychologically fractured, their perception of control shattered. Children were safe, guided expertly, yet the weight of fear and anticipation left its mark. Matteo, small and silent, vanished into the shadows, leaving behind a carefully executed orchestration of panic, observation, and precision that would become legend. Venice remained unaware of the exact details, but whispers of a night filled with terror, shadows, and impossible coordination began to circulate, ensuring that the events would be remembered as both tragedy and marvel. The confusion intensified as Matteo guided children through pre-mapped escape routes. Each child moved with silent coordination, instinctively avoiding hazards and reinforcing the illusion of chaos. The adults, caught in the web of fear and environmental manipulation, reacted erratically, further amplifying the situation. One caretaker attempted to chase a child down a corridor, only to slip on a polished floorboard, sending him sprawling into a shadowed alcove. Panic surged through the remaining staff, their movements uncoordinated, predictable, and easily influenced by the subtle orchestration of the silent boy. Smoke curled from strategically tipped candles, casting grotesque shapes along the walls. Shadows stretched unnaturally across floors and ceilings, creating the impression of movement where none existed. Whispers, carried by children and amplified by the building's acoustics, reinforced the illusion of omnipresence. Matteo's observation allowed him to adjust positions and timing in real time, ensuring that every reaction contributed to the crescendo of fear. The orphanage had become a living instrument, each element tuned to produce maximum psychological impact. As the night wore on, Caretakers' rationality deteriorated. Their attempts to reassert authority were undermined by minor calculated disruptions. A floorboard shifted under weight, a door closed unexpectedly, a distant sound echoed from an empty hallway. Each incident reinforced fear, disorientation, and the perception of a malevolent presence. Children, guided by Matteo, moved with precision and calm, their behavior contrasting starkly with the adults' panic. The contrast heightened the psychological effect, making fear tangible, almost visible, in the eyes of those who had believed themselves in control. The climax reached a terrifying symmetry when a minor fire flared near the main hall. Flames licked walls and ceilings, producing smoke that filled corridors and reduced visibility. Caretakers scrambled, attempting to extinguish the flames while hurting children. Yet every reaction played into Matteo's carefully observed patterns. Children instinctively avoided danger, following hidden paths memorized through weeks of observation. Shadows and whispers created additional confusion, making it impossible for adults to accurately assess the environment. Every element, light, shadow, sound, human behavior, aligned perfectly to heighten chaos and psychological strain. One caretaker, attempting to regain composure, collided with another, sending objects crashing to the floor. The resulting noise amplified panic across the building. Matteo, invisible yet omnipresent, adjusted the subtle placement of children, ensuring that safety was maintained while reinforcing disarray among adults. Every heartbeat, every movement, every reaction became part of a larger pattern, orchestrated silently, invisibly, and perfectly. The orphanage itself seemed alive, responding to the tension and amplifying fear as though it were aware of the unfolding drama. By the early hours of dawn, the climax had reached its apex. Adults were exhausted, psychologically fractured, and utterly disoriented. Children remained unharmed, guided with perfect precision by Matteo's foresight and observation. The orphanage, though physically intact, had become a testament to the power of preparation, intelligence, and patient orchestration. Fear had been cultivated to its maximum effect, authority shattered, and the silent observer had demonstrated control beyond comprehension. The aftermath of the night left permanent psychological scars. Caretakers questioned their own competence, their authority irreparably weakened. Children, though safe, internalized the lessons of fear, anticipation, and the presence of an unseen intelligence. Matteo had vanished into the shadows, leaving behind a meticulously executed event that would become whispered legend. Venice remained unaware of the true orchestration behind the night's terror, only sensing a lingering unease and the faintest echo of whispered tales that would endure for years. The orchestration had been flawless. Every minor disturbance, environmental cue, and human reaction had contributed to the climax. Fear, anticipation, and chaos had been engineered with surgical precision. Matteo's intelligence, observation, and patience had transformed a simple orphanage into a stage for psychological mastery, leaving a mark on all participants, permanent yet invisible to the outside world. The night became a story told in hushed tones, a testament to control, fear, and silent observation. Dawn broke over Venice, fog lingering stubbornly in the canals, hiding the city from prying eyes. The orphanage, though intact physically, bore the invisible marks of the previous night. Caretakers were exhausted, mentally fractured, their authority shattered. Every misstep, every accident, and every unexplainable event had eroded their confidence. The children, though unharmed, carried the weight of fear and anticipation, their behavior subtly altered, their trust in authority shaken but guided by the unseen hand of Matteo. The immediate impact was psychological. Caretakers questioned their competence and reliability, replaying events in their minds and struggling to rationalize the chaos. Rumors spread quietly through Venice, neighbors whispering about strange occurrences, children behaving oddly, and the orphanage exuding a sense of unease. No one could explain the precision of the night's events, the coordination of children, or the uncanny timing of accidents. Matteo remained invisible, yet his influence permeated every memory, every action, every whispered tale. The children adapted quickly to the new dynamic. They learned to anticipate danger, communicate subtly, and respond to cues they did not fully understand. Matteo had created a system of unspoken signals, allowing them to move safely while maintaining the perception of chaos for adults. Fear became a tool, a lesson in observation and adaptability. The orphanage, once merely a place of neglect, had transformed into a living laboratory of human behavior, orchestrated by the smallest presence among them. Caretakers attempted to restore routine, but the psychological fractures persisted. Minor disturbances, shadows, creaking floors, flickering candlelight, triggered disproportionate reactions. Authority could no longer be taken for granted, and every action was colored by doubt and fear. Matteo had demonstrated the fragility of perceived control, the power of observation, and the subtle manipulation of environmental and human variables. The building, the children, and the adults existed in a new equilibrium, one defined by anticipation, caution, and invisible oversight. Outside Venice, rumors grew. Parents, merchants, and city officials spoke quietly of the orphanage, recounting fragmented tales of chaos, fear, and inexplicable coordination. Stories of a silent observer circulated, becoming legend in whispered form. The orphanage gained a reputation not just for neglect, but for the uncanny events of that night, marking it as a place haunted by intelligence, patience, and unseen orchestration. Venice, cloaked in fog and history, remained unaware of the full extent of Matteo's planning. Yet the memory of the night lingered, shaping perception and caution for years to come. Environmental consequences also emerged. Minor damage from fire, displaced furniture, and structural wear created a visual record of chaos. Floors creaked more audibly, doors aligned imperfectly, and shadows stretched in unsettling ways. The orphanage, already oppressive, now carried the tangible and intangible remnants of fear, observation, and manipulation. Matteo's invisible hand had shaped the environment as surely as it had guided human behavior, creating a lasting impression on all who entered. Children who had experienced Matteo's guidance retained heightened awareness, anticipating potential dangers and learning subtle manipulation of their surroundings. Caretakers remained disoriented, their authority undermined, their perception of events incomplete. The orphanage existed as a microcosm of power dynamics, observation, and fear. Every corridor, every shadow, every whisper contributed to a lasting imprint of the previous night's orchestration, ensuring that the lessons of observation, anticipation, and calculated influence would endure. The unresolved nature of the events haunted both children and adults. No one could pinpoint a cause, no one could explain the precision of the orchestration, and no one could recover fully from the psychological impact. Matteo's presence remained a mystery, an unseen force shaping perception and action. Fear became embedded in memory, anticipation became habitual, and every minor disturbance could trigger echoes of the night's events. The orphanage, once neglected, had transformed into a living monument of calculated chaos, observation, and the subtle manipulation of human behavior. The psychological imprint of the night persisted. Caretakers, though attempting to return to normal routines, found themselves hyper-aware of minor anomalies. Every flicker of candlelight, every creak of the floor, every whisper seemed amplified, carrying traces of the orchestrated chaos. Their confidence never fully returned, and subtle panic lingered beneath every decision. Children, meanwhile, internalized the lessons Matteo had imparted silently. Observation, anticipation, and calculated movement became instinctual. The orphanage itself seemed alive with memory, as if the walls and corridors retained echoes of fear and coordination. The city of Venice gradually absorbed rumors into legend. Merchants spoke quietly of the night when the orphanage seemed haunted. Parents whispered about children who behaved differently, and tales of a silent, observing boy spread in hushed tones. The details were fragmented, inconsistent, and surreal, but they reinforced the perception of the orphanage as a place of fear, cunning, and uncanny orchestration. Even without concrete evidence, the city's awareness created an intangible pressure, ensuring that Matteo's influence extended beyond the building, reaching the minds of outsiders through whispers and speculation. Children continued to interact under a new framework. Subtle gestures, quiet movements, and intuitive understanding of environmental cues allowed them to navigate safely while amplifying the psychological effect on adults. Matteo's preparation ensured that even routine activities reinforced patterns of observation, anticipation, and silent influence. Minor incidents, dropped utensils, shifted furniture, misplaced candles, were interpreted as signs of his presence, reinforcing fear while maintaining control. Adults became both participants and victims in a carefully cultivated ecosystem of tension, each reaction further demonstrating the effectiveness of silent orchestration. The structural and environmental consequences of the night were also significant. Floors, slightly warped by minor fire and overuse during chaos, creaked louder than before. Doors hung imperfectly in frames, creating unpredictable movement and drafts. Shadows behaved unusually, accentuated by imperfect candlelight and lingering smoke. These physical markers became tools for further manipulation, whether consciously or subconsciously used by Matteo and observed by children. The building itself had become a dynamic participant in psychological orchestration, responding to behavior, enhancing tension, and reinforcing fear. Caretakers attempted investigation and reconstruction, but every effort revealed the limits of understanding. The sequence of events, though meticulously observed by Matteo, remained invisible and incomprehensible to adults. Every misstep, every environmental quirk, every minor accident contributed to a lingering sense of unease. Patterns were noted but never fully understood. The absence of visible control reinforced the perception of an unseen intelligence at work. The children, under Matteo's subtle guidance, had become experts at navigating these unseen forces, solidifying the balance of power and perception within the orphanage. Months passed, and the orphanage's reputation evolved. It was no longer merely a neglected institution. It became a place whispered about with caution and awe. Tales of the silent observer, of perfectly orchestrated fear, and of adults manipulated beyond comprehension spread throughout Venice. While many dismissed the stories as exaggeration, the persistence and consistency of accounts created an aura of dread. Matteo, small and unseen, had ensured that both memory and perception were aligned with his silent design. The city outside remained largely unaware, yet the orphanage's psychological legacy permeated every whispered conversation and cautious glance toward its shadowed walls. The unresolved nature of events cemented the orphanage in legend. No one could account fully for the precision of chaos, the perfect timing of accidents, or the coordinated behavior of children. Adults doubted their own competence, children learned to anticipate unseen guidance, and the building itself retained echoes of the orchestrated night. Matteo's silent hand had created an environment where fear, anticipation, and subtle influence were embedded in memory, perception, and physical space. The aftermath was complete. Lives altered, authority undermined, and a psychological framework established that would endure indefinitely. Even decades later, the orphanage in Venice retained an aura of incomprehensible mystery. Scholars, historians, and curious visitors tried to unravel the events of that night, yet every explanation fell short. Accounts of the silent boy Matteo persisted, carried in whispered tales and fragmented records. Witnesses recalled shadows moving unnaturally, footsteps echoing without source, and children behaving with eerie coordination. Science attempted to rationalize the occurrences, drafts, structural quirks, psychological contagion. But each theory failed to account for the precise orchestration that had unfolded. Attempts to document the orphanage's history yielded conflicting records. Administrators' logs described minor accidents, fires, and panic, yet the sequence of events made no logical sense. Children's testimonies recorded later included detailed recollections of subtle signals, hidden paths, and silent guidance. These narratives, while consistent, defied conventional understanding. How could a child orchestrate chaos with such precision? How could fear and anticipation be manipulated so thoroughly without detection? Experts admitted failure. No amount of reasoning or measurement could fully explain the phenomena. The city of Venice contributed to the mystery. Fog persisted along the canals, masking the building from prying eyes and allowing stories to evolve without verification. Residents whispered of the orphanage as haunted, cursed, or imbued with inexplicable intelligence. Some claimed to see shadows moving independently. Others reported hearing whispers in empty corridors. Local clergy attempted intervention, blessing the building and performing rituals to remove perceived evil. Yet the event's psychological and environmental intricacies remained unsolved. The orphanage's reputation grew, blending legend, fear, and reality into a narrative resistant to rational analysis. Investigators returned multiple times over the years, examining structural features, environmental conditions, and historical records. Floors were uneven, corridors echoed unnaturally, and shadows stretched in peculiar patterns. Each observation offered partial insight, but never revealed the full orchestration. The combination of Matteo's intelligence, preparation, and subtle influence ensured that the events remained beyond the scope of conventional understanding. No experiment, observation, or logical reconstruction could reproduce the precise interplay of fear, movement, and environmental manipulation that had occurred. Children who had survived under Matteo's guidance occasionally recounted memories of silent communication and invisible orchestration. They spoke of understanding without words, predicting danger instinctively, and observing adults fail to respond rationally. These recollections, though detailed and consistent, conflicted with the adults' fragmented memories, deepening the sense of mystery. Experts attempted to study these accounts through emerging psychological methods, yet the findings were inconclusive. The orchestrated chaos, guided by a child's intelligence and patience, defied analysis, leaving an enduring question. How had a single unseen presence manipulated both human behavior and environmental perception so flawlessly? Legends of Matteo's presence persisted in Venice. Stories described a boy whose intelligence surpassed adults, whose observation was absolute, and whose patience allowed him to orchestrate events with perfect precision. Children and adults alike reported subtle phenomena long after the night in question: flickering lights, unexplained sounds, and the uncanny feeling of being watched. Attempts to rationalize these experiences failed, reinforcing the orphanage's reputation as a place beyond comprehension. Every shadow, every whisper, and every minor disturbance was interpreted as a lingering effect of Matteo's orchestration. Environmental conditions played a continuous role in sustaining the mystery. Fog, drafts, uneven floors, and poorly aligned doors created unpredictable variables that perpetuated fear and disorientation. Visitors and caretakers alike experienced subtle anomalies, shadows that shifted unnaturally, sounds without sources, and a pervasive sense of anticipation that could not be explained scientifically. Even decades later, these phenomena persisted, resisting logical analysis and reinforcing the perception of a cursed or haunted environment. Visitors attempting to explore the orphanage often reported feelings of unease and disorientation, as if unseen eyes tracked every movement. Even structural anomalies, such as creaking floors and misaligned doors, seemed amplified in perception, creating experiences that could not be rationalized. Children, attuned to subtle environmental cues, navigated the space with ease, while adults stumbled, overwhelmed by fear and anticipation. No logical explanation could reconcile these experiences, reinforcing the notion that the orphanage was influenced by an intelligence beyond comprehension. Historical records added complexity to the mystery. Caretaker reports from the months following the night described events in fragmented, contradictory ways. Minor accidents, whispers, and miscommunications were recorded inconsistently, and each narrative contradicted the next. Yet across all accounts, one detail remained constant. The precision of events suggested unseen orchestration. Scholars, psychologists, and historians acknowledged that standard analysis failed to account for the alignment of human behavior, environmental factors, and the coordinated actions of children under Matteo's subtle guidance. Local folklore intertwined with historical accounts, blending legend and fact into an enduring narrative. Tales of the silent boy spread across Venice, describing a presence capable of manipulating both perception and reality. Children recounted observing adults misinterpret events, while adults recalled fleeting shadows, inexplicable sounds, and the eerie coordination of the orphaned children. Even as years passed, these accounts persisted, creating a layered understanding of the orphanage as a site of mystery, fear, and extraordinary intelligence. No scientific method could reconcile the combination of observation, environmental manipulation, and human reaction that had occurred. Repeated investigations by city officials failed to provide clarity. Each visit uncovered structural and environmental anomalies, but none could explain the psychological impact or the apparent coordination of events. Minor repairs, candle placement adjustments, and observational experiments failed to reproduce the precise orchestration experienced during that infamous night. Experts concluded that the combination of human intelligence, patient observation, and subtle environmental manipulation had created a phenomenon that defied rational explanation. The orphanage's psychological impact persisted across generations. Children who had survived under Matteo's guidance retained heightened awareness and intuition, teaching younger occupants subtle patterns of observation, movement, and anticipation. Adults, meanwhile, continued to experience unease, shadows, and unexplained sounds, reinforcing the building's reputation as cursed or haunted. Attempts to apply logic, science, or rational inquiry consistently failed, cementing the sense that the events could never be fully understood or replicated. Even contemporary visitors noted anomalies. Shadows shifted unpredictably, footsteps echoed without apparent origin, and whispers seemed to follow specific corridors. Every structural imperfection, uneven floors, drafty windows, misaligned doors, amplified these phenomena. Scholars recognized that environmental variables had interacted with human behavior to create lasting psychological effects, yet the precision of the original orchestration remained inexplicable. Matteo's intelligence and patient planning had left a legacy that resisted analysis, creating a permanent aura of mystery around the orphanage. The unsolved nature of these events elevated the orphanage to legend. Reports, testimonies, and folklore blended, creating an enduring narrative of fear, control, and invisible intelligence. Attempts at rational explanation, scientific observation, psychological analysis, or architectural study failed repeatedly. Shadows, whispers, and minor disturbances continued to confound visitors, ensuring that the orphanage remained an enduring symbol of unsolved mystery, subtle orchestration, and human susceptibility to unseen forces. The city of Venice, wrapped in fog and history, preserved the orphanage's reputation as a site where logic failed, fear persisted, and a child's silent intelligence remained forever enigmatic. Venice awoke to the aftermath of fear, its fog lingering over silent canals, as if reflecting the tension that had once consumed the orphanage. Matteo's presence remained invisible, yet the impact of his orchestration was indelible. Caretakers, fractured by panic and confusion, struggled to regain authority, their confidence forever diminished. Children, though physically unharmed, carried psychological scars, aware of the invisible force that had guided them and disrupted their guardians. The building itself, bearing marks of minor fires, displaced furniture, and structural quirks, stood as a silent witness to orchestrated chaos, echoing with shadows and whispers. The city around the orphanage continued its rhythm, indifferent to the drama contained within. Markets thrived, gondolas drifted, and masked balls drew attention elsewhere. Yet those who ventured near the orphanage sensed unease, a tension that could not be measured or fully explained. Visitors reported flickering lights, creaking floors, and inexplicable sounds. Children moved instinctively through corridors, anticipating minor hazards, while adults were subtly manipulated by fear and environmental cues. Venice, shrouded in fog, became a city living with the shadow of what had occurred, a place where logic and perception diverged in the haunting memory of a night orchestrated by a silent boy. The legacy of Matteo's actions was tragic and complex. Adults' authority had been undermined permanently, their rationality challenged by invisible orchestration. Children developed heightened perception and anticipation, surviving with skill but internalizing fear and psychological pressure. The orphanage itself became a monument to careful manipulation, observation, and patient intelligence, an enduring testament to the power of subtle influence. Every corridor, staircase, and shadow was a participant in an unbroken pattern of tension, observation, and psychological impact, leaving Venice with a story that could neither be fully explained nor forgotten. Over time, stories of the night spread through whispered legends, transforming the orphanage into a symbol of fear, intelligence, and unseen orchestration. Scholars attempted to document and rationalize events, yet every account highlighted the unsolved nature of what had occurred. Shadows moved in inexplicable ways. Whispers echoed down empty halls, and children recounted memories of silent guidance and anticipation. Venice remained captivated by the tales, unable to reconcile the precision of chaos with the apparent power of a single unseen child. Psychological impacts persisted across generations. Caretakers who had survived experienced recurring unease, a subtle reminder of their vulnerability and the fragility of authority. Children, while safe, internalized lessons of observation, anticipation, and the power of silent guidance. The orphanage became both a place of survival and a monument to fear, a location where environmental cues, human behavior, and subtle manipulation converged into enduring psychological influence. Even decades later, visitors and residents reported sensations of being watched, whispers in empty corridors and shadows behaving unnaturally. The tragic note of the orphanage was dual. Lives had been altered permanently, and yet no one could fully understand the orchestrated events. Matteo, silent and unseen, had ensured that chaos, fear, and psychological manipulation left lasting imprints on both children and adults. Authority had been shattered, perception had been manipulated, and the building itself carried the memory of calculated orchestration. Venice, despite the city's thriving life and distractions, bore the subtle echoes of the night, fog amplifying both mystery and unease, shadows preserving the legacy of careful planning and silent influence. The orphanage's reputation became legendary, blending fear, psychological insight, and environmental manipulation. Shadows, whispers, and minor anomalies persisted, reinforcing the memory of that night. Adults remained cautious, children remained perceptive, and the building itself seemed to breathe with the echoes of unseen orchestration. No rational explanation could encompass the events, and no scientific method could replicate the precision of Matteo's influence. Venice's fog-bound streets held the whispers of legend, the weight of unresolved mystery, and the haunting knowledge that a child's silent intelligence had forever altered a place and its inhabitants. Even as years passed, the tragic and haunting nature of the events endured. Scholars, residents, and visitors could recount incidents, yet the full orchestration remained hidden, a ghostly presence shaping perception and memory. Matteo's legacy was one of intelligence, patience, and silent mastery, ensuring that both fear and fascination persisted in equal measure. The orphanage, physically unchanged but psychologically transformed, stood as a monument to unseen influence, the culmination of calculated observation, anticipation, and human vulnerability. Venice, shrouded in fog and history, preserved the story of the silent boy, whose careful orchestration left a mark that could never be erased. As the years unfolded, the orphanage retained its aura of tension and unease. New caretakers arrived, unaware of the history, yet quickly sensed the peculiar atmosphere. Shadows seemed longer, whispers softer yet persistent, and children moved with uncanny precision, anticipating hazards adults could not perceive. Each generation experienced echoes of Matteo's orchestration, though the boy himself had long vanished. The building had absorbed his meticulous manipulation, the corridors and floors carrying the memory of fear, anticipation, and silent intelligence. Residents of Venice continued to whisper about the orphanage, blending legend and truth. Parents recounted stories of children who seemed older than their years, whose awareness and subtle communication hinted at knowledge beyond explanation. Scholars and historians revisited accounts, structural analyses, and testimonies, yet all failed to reconcile the events logically. Every explanation fell short, leaving the orphanage shrouded in mystery. Visitors reported fleeting shadows, untraceable sounds, and an overwhelming sense of being observed, reinforcing the notion that the building itself had retained a form of intelligence, a ghostly reflection of Matteo's silent orchestration. The psychological legacy extended beyond the orphanage. Children who had survived under Matteo's guidance carried lessons of anticipation, observation, and manipulation into adulthood. They influenced peers subtly, demonstrated heightened awareness in mundane tasks, and retained the memory of fear as a tool for caution. Adults, meanwhile, remained haunted by the memory of loss of control, their confidence in authority permanently undermined. The orphanage had become a crucible for human behavior, observation, and subtle influence, its impact echoing across decades. Attempts to rehabilitate or repurpose the building were fraught with difficulty. Caretakers, new and old, struggled with minor anomalies, doors that misaligned overnight, shadows that shifted unexpectedly, and noises without discernible sources. Psychological stress persisted, creating a lingering aura of dread. Every intervention seemed temporary, as if the building itself had absorbed the orchestration of fear and subtly manipulated perception. Even structural repairs failed to remove the intangible weight of history, the echo of calculated chaos remaining embedded in corridors, walls, and floors. The tragic and haunting note of the orphanage was reinforced by the persistence of unresolved mystery. Despite years of observation, study, and rational analysis, no one could fully explain the events of that fateful night. Shadows, whispers, and inexplicable coordination of children remained central to the legend. Matteo's silent intelligence, his patience, and his meticulous orchestration left a permanent imprint, ensuring that the orphanage was forever a site of fascination, fear, and unresolved psychological mastery. Venice, with its fog-bound canals and labyrinthine streets, preserved the memory, whispers, and lessons of the silent boy for generations to come. The culmination of all events left an indelible mark on the city and all who experienced the orphanage. Caretakers lived in cautious vigilance, children grew in heightened awareness, and the building itself became a participant in the enduring orchestration of fear. Matteo's intelligence had transcended physical presence, embedding itself in perception, memory, and environmental manipulation. The orphanage stood as a monument to the subtle power of observation, anticipation, and calculated influence, a dark testament to human vulnerability, and the haunting presence of a silent orchestrator whose legacy could neither be erased nor fully understood.